Okay, so welcome to this International Women's Day event linked to the Trade and Exchange Art Commissions. So my name is Ceri Campbell and I'm the Associate Director for Arts and Culture at the University of Exeter. And if you haven't heard of us yet, Arts and Culture run creative interdisciplinary projects drawing on University of Exeter research, and we support and develop creative networks both across the 4 university campuses in Devon and Cornwall, as well as being an active member of the creative sector in the region. And I think a link is going to be shared in the chat for where you can find out more about us. Before we begin, I'd like to just take a moment to reflect on what International Women's Day is about. So the theme for 2021 is #ChooseToChallenge. And we have set the question, how will you help forge a gender equal world? And there are 3 tasks to that. Celebrate women's achievement, raise awareness against bias, and take action for equality. And in the spirit of sisterhood, I highly recommend Occupy the Airwaves, which has been running on Resonance FM all day by the fantastic Dreadnought Southwest. So after our event, do please check them out. So just a few things about our rules of engagement this evening. We want to create a supportive and welcome environment that is open to everyone. And we're looking forward to having 75 minutes of mind-expanding ideas and discussion. We will Jackie Weaver you if we have to, but we really hope that it doesn't quite come to that. So do please keep your microphones on mute, and you're welcome to have your cameras on. We recommend you have them off during the presentations, but if you'd like them on during the questions, that's fine. And for anyone who's joined us since we started, we are recording the event. So if you'd like to remain anonymous, do please keep your camera off. We'd love to know where you're zooming in from. So if you'd like to say hi in the chat and say which part of the world you're in, you're welcome to. And if you've got any questions for the panel this evening, I will be collecting those as we go. So do please put a Q at the beginning of your comment in the chat. And so that way I know which ones to pick up, and I will try to ask as many of them as possible. So to move on to Trade and Exchange itself, to give a bit of context. So the commission is with 2 artists, Naomi Hart and Emma Maloney, and each will be taking over an empty shop window in Exeter City Centre and creating new temporary works of art. An inspiration for these works has come from the theme of trade and exchange and the collections at the Devon and Exeter Institution, the DEI. Now, the commissions were originally planned for installation in January, and I probably don't have to explain why we weren't allowed to go ahead with that. So we've pushed everything back to mid-April, and I'll give more details of exactly where the work's going to be shown at the end. And the lead partner for Trade and Exchange is Exeter Culture, and it's been generously funded by the Livable Exeter programme managed by Exeter City Council, and the Next Chapter project at the Devon and Exeter Institution funded by the National Heritage Lottery Fund. Now, in developing the commissions, both artists discovered stories in the DEI about 18th and 19th century research into the natural world where women's contributions were marginalised. So to mark International Women's Day, we've invited the artists to speak about how their new commissions are progressing and to be joined by 2 leading academics from the University of Exeter, Dr. Kerry Lewis and Dr. Becker Lovell, to speak about their relevant research in the natural and social sciences. So the format this evening is hopefully relatively straightforward. We're going to have each pairing speak for about 10 minutes each, and then we'll have space of about 10 minutes for questions. And it is fascinating. We could talk for days about all of it. So I apologise in advance that this will be to whet your appetite, but probably also leave you hungry. So I will introduce the first 2 speakers, and then we'll go from there. So Naomi Hart and Dr. Kerry Lewis are our first pairing. Naomi Hart is an artist whose work looks at human interactions with the environment, especially themes around elements, journey, and memory. Her work ranges from intricate drawings and paintings to large-scale installations. Naomi was Leverhulme Artist in Residence with glaciologists from Sheffield University and the University of Norway in Svalbard, and exhibited the work at the Royal Geographical Society in London. Dr. Kerry Lewis's research interests lie in understanding how marine invertebrates adapt and survive in a changing and increasingly polluted marine environment, and the potential impacts of environmental change on their physiology and reproduction. So that's enough from me. I will now hand you over to Naomi.
Hello, everyone. Hopefully you can see the full screen picture rather than just me. Great. So thank you very much, Sarah. Thank you to everybody for coming. This is a really exciting event and it's lovely to be here. I'm just going to talk very briefly about my work and just about the start of the journey for this commission. So the image that you can see is from an installation that I created a few years ago, which was called All About Migration. And in this, I hand cut, with help from friends, 10,000 postcards in the shape of Brent geese, which were then sent all over the world. They were blank on one side and I invited people to write on them, draw me a picture and then post them back to me with their GPS or their address on them, their postcode, so that I could tell where they'd come from. And the ones that migrated back, I hung in a great big exhibition, an installation in the studio that I had at the time. So really what I want to highlight about this is how fascinating it was to see all of these tiny stories, all of these tiny individual pieces of information, of learning, of lives, which came to get together to create something much larger. And this is me in the DEI, the Devon and Exeter Institution, which is the most incredible collection and building. It's a real privilege to be in there. You can join as a member and you can get to go yourself, and I would recommend it. It's the most beautiful thing to be sitting in there in leather armchairs with books that are 300 years old, surrounded by all of that knowledge and learning. One of the first books that I found was in the natural history selection, and it's a small book and it's called A Conchological Dictionary of the British Islands. That's a shell dictionary to you and me. It's by William Turton, MD. Assisted by his daughter. I was really intrigued by this. Now, I'm really grateful that she gets a mention, but we don't know her name. We don't know how she assisted. So it sort of sparked a little something in me, and I started looking through some of the other books. And the DEI have an amazing collection. So this is a page from a 3-volume book, Testacea Britannica, or Natural History of British Shells, and this is by George Montague. And in this one, we do know the illustrator, and it was illustrations by Elizabeth Dorville. So she was actually in a long-term relationship with Montague, but he acknowledges her work. And the year he died, Montague gave copies of Testacea Britannica to the science collection at the new Devon and Exeter Institution in 1815. He gave his collection of shells that all of these illustrations were drawn from to his son, Henry Dorville, who subsequently gave them to the Royal Albert Memorial Museum, or RAM, in Exeter. So this is a fascinating thing. We have the shells, we have this whole collection within the city belonging to this collection. And all of these collections are available online, so you can actually go and look at them, even if you don't live in Exeter. None of us can get into the buildings at the moment, but you can see these collections. And this is just one of the images from the RAM collection. I chose this one purely because of the name. I love the idea of a depressed sunset clown. Looking further into shell books, I found these incredible illustrations. So these are by Susanna and Anna Lister, and they are part of the Historiae Conciliorum by Martin Lister, who was their father, and it was published in 1685. Not only that, but Susanna and Anna were teenagers at the time. They did all of the drawings, all of the research, all of the engraving of the copper plates, and all of the printing themselves. It's the most astonishing book, and I highly recommend you can also view this online. It really is astonishing, not just for the age, but I would say in any age. They're beautiful pieces of art, but the scientific learning is evident. Somebody slightly better known is Anna Atkins. So she was more famous for her collection of seaweeds and she created cyanotypes. So that was a new form of photography at the time. And she made these she created these and did a whole research. So she collected the seaweeds, made these images, and she was recognized for her science. So I'm just having a struggle with this covering up all of the pictures, the little face boxes. So less known is the fact that she was an illustrator as well. So this is an original illustration of a giant clam by Anna Atkins. And it's one of hundreds of scientific illustrations that she drew for her father's English translation of Lamarck's Genera of Shells. And women were integral to all of this scientific research, but they don't always get the acclaim. I noticed also that many of the shell collections of the books about shells, the books about seaweed in the DEI collection had belonged to a Mrs. Griffiths. They came from the collection of a Mrs. Griffiths. And this turned out to be Amelia Griffiths. Now, she collected and preserved hundreds of species of seaweed and was one of the first women to be recognized for contributions to science. So her collection, she pressed these and collected them into books. They used to belong to the DEI. The DEI ran out of space and they've now been given over to RAM, to the Royal Albert Memorial Museum. So again, we have this whole collection and the DEI was fundamental to this. Griffiths was often accompanied by Mary Wyatt, who was a former servant of hers, but eventually she actually ran a shop in Torquay selling shells, which subsidized her science. So we also have working class women involved in this. This was seen as something that women could enter. It was a genteel, it was a polite way of doing art and science. Unfortunately, that kind of shop selling shells still exists. And it's a huge industry now, a global industry. They're sold as ornaments or souvenirs, and it involves around 5,000 species of mollusks, which are mostly killed just to be sold. And this has a huge impact on the ecosystem. There's another dark side to shells as well within trade. These are Monetaria monita, or money cowrie, and they've been used as currency in many parts of the world. They were intrinsically involved in the slave trade, so they were brought from the Indian Ocean to the UK as ballast in ships, and then taken to West Africa to be traded in exchange for enslaved people. Slightly brighter symbolism for cowries, because of their resemblance to female anatomy, and with a rounded top like a pregnant woman's belly, they symbolize fertility. So Japanese women would have held them during childbirth, and Egyptian women sewed them into their aprons to prevent miscarriage. I've been doing some studies. This is an oyster shell, just looking at how it's made up. And it's made with indigo and painted with estuary water. So oysters, again, are vitally important for food source. And we have pearls, which again are a multi-million-pound industry globally. But all of these mollusks, all of these shellfish are affected by climate change. So climate change means warmer oceans, which are more acidic, and this affects the ability of shellfish to build shells. Now, that's all I'm going to tell you about it, because we have an internationally renowned marine biologist about to talk to you next. So listen to her, don't listen to me. But I was chatting with her and I was really intrigued by this, about the effect that these warmer oceans have on shells. So I decided I wanted to simulate global warming in my kitchen. So this is an oyster shell, which I've put in a miniature ocean of lemon juice, which is acidic. Now it's far more acidic than seawater, but this is the effect in just a couple of days. And I'm really intrigued by this sort of exchange, chemical exchange that's going on. Shells were also used in art in different ways. So this has gold leaf in it that's been reduced to powder form by grinding it with honey. It's then washed away. And the name shell gold, which is what the color is called, derives from the mussel shells it was once stored in. And many paints were transported in this way because they form a perfect little waterproof container. Mussel shells, again, these are from the RAM collection, and this is Mytilus edulis, the common or edible mussel. And it's an important food source, not just for us, but for many species. Blue mussels are filter feeders and play a vital role in estuaries by removing bacteria and toxins. But again, this has other implications, and I think Kerry's going to talk a little bit about that. What I'm really interested here is you can see on the shells, the rings, the layers building up year on year as they grow, like shelves of books in a library. So I'm really interested in all of this accumulation of meaning and symbolism, all of this accumulation of knowledge, the science building upon previous experiments and discoveries, like growth rings in trees. We artists, scientists, or whatever our skills, can all add our part to the story. And I leave you with a tiny little teaser image for the artwork which I'll be creating for the installation. So check out my website or social media at the beginning of April. Mine's actually going to start maybe a little bit before the date that Sarah will tell you about. But I'm now going to hand over to Dr. Kerry Lewis, who is going to tell you a little bit about the science about all of these shellfish. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Naomi. Let me see if I can share my screen. Okay, can everyone see that?
Yeah, all good.
There we go, brilliant. Well, Naomi's given us a wonderful insight into the beauty of shells. I'm a marine biologist, really interested in how the animals living within these shells and other marine invertebrates are responding to the changes we are seeing in our global ocean at the moment. But I very much started this journey as a young child, loving rock pooling, just being fascinated by the beautiful shells that I found on my beach. And I still very much enjoy just going along and picking up shells and looking at them. But I'm really interested in the animals that live inside them as well. And I very much was as a child. I think that's what drew me into this career. And these are the types of animals we're generally talking about when we're talking about our shelled animals. We're talking about mollusks. The ones you're most likely to be familiar with are bivalves, these oysters and mussels, and our gastropods, the marine snails that quite often have the much more colourful shells that you might recognise. Now, the humble mussel may not be the most attractive shell in anyone's collection, but it certainly is an incredibly important animal. And just to give you a little fact, that a mussel bed can provide habitat for over 200 other different species, just because of the complex environment it creates when it makes these mussel beds. But the common feature of our mollusks is this hard shell, this calcium carbonate shell, which, as Naomi has told us, is actually vulnerable to this process called ocean acidification. So sorry for a bit of science here, but ocean acidification is quite often referred to as the evil twin of global warming. It's driven by the same driver, this increase in atmospheric carbon dioxide. And carbon dioxide has always dissolved into our oceans. About a third of atmospheric carbon dioxide will dissolve into seawater, react with water, and form this very weak carbonic acid. But our oceans are well buffered against any kind of pH change by carbonate ions, which are put into seawater through geological timescale weathering of rocks and previous shells that add this carbonate into the water that soaks up these hydrogen ions that are released from this weak acid. The problem with ocean acidification is that the rate at which we're putting carbon dioxide into the atmosphere is overwhelming this natural buffering capacity, which happens on a much slower timescale. And so we're seeing the pH of our oceans slowly decrease. And that's not just affecting the pH in terms of our hydrogen ion concentrations, it's reducing the amount of carbonate that's there. And that makes the oceans more corrosive to these shelled animals. They're now having to fight a bit harder to make their calcium carbonate shells because the carbonate that they need is being reduced. We're talking about a small pH change. So at the moment, oceans are about a pH of 8.1. We're talking about a reduction by the end of the century down to a pH of 7.7. Now that might sound like a really small change, but pH is measured on a logarithmic scale. So that's a change in hydrogen ion concentration of 120%. And that's a far bigger change than our marine animals have seen over geological timescales for millions of years. This is just a visualization of these changes, and we talk about it as the calcified saturation state, the saturation state of this calcium carbonate in seawater. And as our colors turn orange, that's the seawater becoming corrosive to these marine animals. You'll spot straight away that our Arctic waters are becoming corrosive first and fastest. These are cold waters, so they take up more carbon dioxide, and they have a naturally lower buffering capacity of this carbonate ions. Because it's a freshwater influenced ocean, all of the ice melt from summer melt of the Arctic dilutes that carbonate, so they're much more vulnerable to this change. But Naomi did her lovely experiment with just shells, but mostly we're not talking about shells responding to these changes. Animals are not lumps of chalk. They're capable of actively responding to this change. We're making their job harder by changing the chemistry of the oceans, but they are able to increase their energy input into calcification. So we're not actually talking about animals dissolving, but we do see some very interesting changes in the beautiful crystalline structure of their shells. This was a really nice experiment done by a colleague of mine, Susan Fitzer, who looked at this biomineralization process. So as we go from left to right on your screen, this is going towards the end of the century in terms of how much CO2 in the atmosphere and the change that drives in our ocean pH. On the left, you can see in current conditions, this wonderful organized calcite crystalline formation that makes the mussel shells lovely and strong. It's what protects them when the tide goes out from desiccation stress. It's what protects them from predators who might try to eat them when the tide is out. But as we go into the future ocean, this structure gets distorted. So they are still calcifying, they're laying down this shell, but that beautiful structure is now disrupted. And this affects the integral structure of this shell. It means they're softer and they're less able to withstand this sort of predatory attack. This is another beautiful shelled organism that we find in the sea. It's called a pteropod. It's sometimes called a sea butterfly because the way it swims, it's got this lovely foot that it uses almost like butterfly wings. And it's also sometimes referred to as the potato chips of the sea because so many fish rely on this as a food source. You get a lot of pteropods in our Arctic waters. And as we saw in that schematic, the Arctic is where these changes are happening first and fastest. And we can already see, if we put nets into the ocean and pull out these beautiful creatures, the integrity of their shell is already being impacted. Now, the picture on the screen is an exaggerated version of this. Some of these have been done in lab experiments, but we already see pitted shells, corrosive patches on their shells when we're collecting these animals already. So we're already seeing the impacts of this changing ocean chemistry on the integrity of these shells. Now, it's not just the changing ocean chemistry we can learn about looking at things like mussels. Mussels are also incredibly useful indicator species for looking at climate change impacts in terms of warming as well as acidification. Mussels are intertidal, they occur quite high up on the shore, and so they're already experiencing heat stress on a daily basis. They're incredibly resilient organisms. They have a whole suite of physiological responses to cope with that heat stress when the tide is out. But at some points, those physiological responses get overwhelmed. We have tipping points. And so people are using mussels to look at how heat waves, which are increasing as we go into more global warming, is impacting the physiology of these mussels. At what point do those physiological responses be overwhelmed and we get mortality events? People are even using robo-mussels, putting all sorts of sensors in mussel shells and sticking them in various parts of the environment to really get detailed data on what's happening inside a mussel shell as warming progresses. In my lab, we've been looking at some of the drivers of these physiological responses, trying to work out whether the change in this ocean chemistry is more important than the heat stress of a mussel at the top of the shore. And actually, we found temperature causes far more acidosis inside the animals than the ocean acidification that we get when the tide is in. And body size is also important. Large mussels struggle much more on hot days at the top of the shore than small mussels. And so we're looking at potential drivers on body size of mussels as global warming progresses. But mussels are also incredible filter feeders. The speeded up footage you're seeing here is a time lapse of some mussels clearing algae from a beaker of water. They can filter up to 50 litres of water a day, a single mussel, and so they're incredibly efficient at cleaning the water and anything that's in the water. Now, unfortunately, this makes them susceptible to any contaminants that are also present in the water. they will draw vast volumes of water over their gills and take out some of those contaminants from the water, clearing up the water, but obviously causing toxicity effects to the mussels. And because of this fantastic filtering capacity and the volumes of water in which they take in, mussels have been used as indicator species for pollution around the world for decades. Mussel Watch is a program that basically uses mussels as bioindicators of the contamination of any environment, where instead of having to collect vast quantities of water and doing expensive chemistry, mussels are used instead to tell us about the contaminants that are in the environment. So they're incredibly useful monitoring species as well. But I'm sure it won't surprise you to realise that the mussels taking in these contaminants can also interact with all of the other stresses that are going on in the changing ocean. So as the pH of our seawater changes, it changes these responses to contaminants. Many of the contaminants that we find in our ocean waters are pH sensitive. And so as the pH of the ocean changes with ocean acidification, the way in which these contaminants are taken up and the mussel responds to them is also changing. It's something we're doing a lot of work on in my lab at the moment, is trying to understand whether you get increases in toxicity or decreases as this pH changes. And it turns out that it depends on many things, not just the chemistry of the contaminant, but also the physiological response of the mussel. But just as an example, copper, which is one of our most ubiquitous coastal contaminants still as a result of historic mining, the DNA damage that we see in response to copper is 90% higher when we are looking at ocean acidification conditions compared to modern day conditions. So there's real synergies between these different stresses and interactions that we need to do a lot more work on to fully understand. The contaminant that you're probably most familiar with at the moment is microplastics. And unfortunately, we are finding microplastics in pretty much every part of the ocean that we look. And this is only going to go up if we continue making plastics at the rate of which we are at the moment. It's expected to triple the amount of plastic going into the oceans in just the next 10 years if we don't change our relationship with plastic. And in the same way that mussels take up these other contaminants because of the way in which they feed, we're finding microplastics in mussels as well. We did a study around the southwest coast and we found microplastic contamination in 89% of the mussels that we sampled. We're not talking about huge amounts of microplastic, it was about 8 particles per mussel, but it was highly prevalent in every population that we looked at. And another big focus of the research in my lab is understanding the impacts for the health of the mussels of this particle that they're taking in. I wanted to finish with a bit of a positive note rather than just all these horrible things that are happening in our ocean, because whilst these changes seem vast, they are related. Quite often people think that plastic pollution and climate change are sort of competing stresses, and that actually we should maybe not worry about plastic so much because climate change is the bigger problem. They're actually very closely related. And if we continue making plastics at the rate at which that increase is happening at the moment, plastic production will account for nearly 13% of our entire remaining carbon budget by the year 2050. So they're very related problems, but they're both problems that we can do something about. Our research in Exeter is really switching these days from the sort of doom stamp collecting, documenting all the things that we're doing wrong in our oceans, to starting to look for some solutions. And there's some fantastic research looking at solutions both to our carbon footprint and our plastic relationship that are happening at the moment. But as individuals, I want to hopefully inspire you all to feel like you can do some positive changes as well. Small changes add up very quickly, particularly in plastics. Simple things like changing your water bottle use. 38.5 million single-use plastic bottles are used every day. So if you just stop buying single-use plastic bottles every day, that's already a massive input, a change to the amount of plastics that are going into our landfill and eventually ending up in our oceans. We talk about rethinking and refusing before we reduce and reuse and recycle. And ultimately what we need to do is to start to move to much more circular systems, circular economy systems, because that ultimately affects both of these stresses, our carbon footprint and our plastic use, by just reducing the amount of waste in which we produce. Okay, I will stop there. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Naomi and Kerry, for that. Terrifying and fascinating all at the same time. This is now audience, this is your opportunity. If you have any questions, do please put them in the chat. You're welcome to ask yourself if you'd like to I think the chat is the best place I will see it. Otherwise, you will have 10 minutes of my questions because there's also a lot more that I want to find out. So to begin, whilst everyone's thinking, I've always been interested in arts and science crossovers, and I think it's really fascinating the way that artists dive into the sciences, and Naomi's practice is such a good example of that, and likewise with Kerry's work, how visual both the research can be with those extraordinary images of the shell patterns, and then also the kind of communications and understanding, and there can be very strong visual aspects to the sciences side. So I was wondering, Naomi, if you'd like to speak to, where do you stop as an artist if you're diving deeper and deeper into a subject that might be new? You could just go on forever. So how do you sort of anchor your own work alongside all these things that you're learning about?
I don't know if there's a distinct pre-considered point. I think sometimes it will spark an image in my head. Quite often I have an image quite early on that appears, and I then research in a particular direction to, I guess, to feed into that. I constantly, as I said, I come back to this idea of layers. So for example, with this commission, started looking at shells, and then I started looking at the language as well. So I look at the word and I follow those meanings of the word, and I follow different strands. And sometimes you do have to edit a little bit about, okay, that's maybe going off on too big a tangent, or, you know, it's too many levels. I think it's possibly intangible. I don't really know necessarily when the art comes in. I think you just know when you have a strong image or a feeling that's interesting, and hopefully that translates. Usually a sort of gut feeling is when you know that you've got something that other people will relate to as well. And I think it's different with every piece, but certainly, yes, you could read forever. I did have to be slightly kicked out of the DEI. Emma very kindly said, maybe it's time to start sort of, you know, actually making the piece other than just reading all of the books.
Well, I can see why, you know, a kind of a curious mind will keep going. And Kerry, I know that you and Naomi have worked together before, and there may be other artist projects that I don't know about. What do you kind of get, I suppose, from these sorts of collaborations? What does it mean for you?
Well, it's twofold, really. Firstly, I mean, Naomi came on a Galapagos research trip with me to help document the work we were doing on plastic pollution of the Galapagos. And as a scientist working on these sorts of issues, we absolutely feel duty bound to share the knowledge that we're generating and share the issue and raise awareness of it. And so having someone with a much better talent for visual communication than me come along and engage in a different way really changes the way in which we are able to communicate these important messages. But also it almost gives me new eyes to look at things that I've been studying for years and years, to have somebody with a completely different way of thinking about things come along and just ask questions and point things that maybe, you know, I haven't looked at in that way because I've been focusing on some tiny little detail. So it helps you step back and see the bigger picture, helps you think about things in new and creative ways. And as scientists, we're being creative too. We're trying to think of, you know, the new ideas, the new questions that we need to ask. And so having someone who is genuinely brilliantly creative come along really stimulates those ideas too. So it's a lot of fun, and I've really enjoyed working with Naomi.
It's that stepping outside of your own bubble, isn't it? I think in both directions ends up being the real power, just to kind of open thinking up. We've had a question from Caroline Hampson. She writes, art is so powerful. Is the hope your installation will positively change people's behaviours? And will you be evaluating the project in any way? So just to speak briefly to the second part about evaluation, I would love to sort of insert a chip in everybody who sees an artwork and then follow what they do next, because it would just help the argument for the arts no end. It's very difficult to track down this stuff. When you work in the field, you know it, you see it in lots of sort of accumulated ways. So to my knowledge, there will be evaluation. The challenge will be, to your first question about how do we really track the impact that it will have on people's views. So Kerry and Naomi, the hope that we will positively change people's behaviours, both for this work and more broadly.
So I guess, yes, I do hope that. I don't go into these trying to sort of dictate. I hope it's not too didactic and just saying you must do this, because you know, change needs to come from within. We need to want to do something. What I try to do is create something that is possibly beautiful or intriguing or has a wow factor or people want to look at, and hopefully then they see it and then they go closer and they may then see, they may find out other things behind that. So another work that I did was called Swift, and it was a large outdoor installation, and it was made of plastic milk bottles collected from the cafes in the shopping centre and cut into the shape of swifts, and they were strung onto copper wire. So that was talking about plastic and pollution and recycling, and the copper was about resources and about the migration of the birds. Hopefully people saw it, looked at it and thought, wow, that's amazing. And then maybe thought, oh, it's from all the plastic milk bottles. Oh, I wonder why we've got so many of them. And maybe it starts to intrigue people, because we're all working at different levels. Some of us have a lot of knowledge, are very engaged in these issues. A scientist, you know, Kerry has far more knowledge than I do about certain subjects, about those subjects. We're all coming at it from different points of view. But what I want to do is maybe start conversations and maybe intrigue people and kind of pull them in to start looking at those questions. As for tracking it, I have had lovely comments about that installation. So an artist friend of mine who I happened to bump into, and he said, oh, I was talking to some children recently and they said they were making these Swift mobiles inspired by an artist that they'd seen their work. And he told me that, and it's just the most moving thing, because it wasn't something that I asked for. It was something you have affected what somebody else thinks. And I think it's very, very hard to gauge, and you don't often get that feedback, but you just have to hope that you're having some effect. And I think we can see how people's attitudes are changing with all of the advocacy, with the science, with the activism that's going on. We can see how it is all changing. Artists can't do it on their own, scientists can't do it on their own. We all have to do this together.
I mean, I very much think that you get to tap into a different audience when you're communicating science through art. I mean, we do our science outreach talks all the time. We go into schools, but we know that we're probably normally catching the same audience on most of those occasions. So to have art as another way of tapping into a new audience, I think can be an incredibly powerful thing.
And when my mouse works. One more question just before we move on to the next pairing. Is it ever possible for either of you to go to a beach or a coastline without it being a busman's holiday now? Can you just be on? No, I didn't think so. You can't just be on the beach anymore.
I mean, I'm terrible now. I can't go to a beach without seeing plastic, and it's so heartbreaking. But I can still have a lovely time on a beach and get excited about all the small animals that I find, or just being in the sea. But yeah, I'm terrible. If there's a speck of plastic, I'll spot it.
and I have hoarding. I don't know if you're on the screen. I have hoarding tendencies. So yes, I go and I see something. I think, oh, I'll just pick that up because that's an interesting piece. And then I end up collecting an entire plastic bag full of the rubbish and having to cart it home with me. And, you know, but yes, it's inspiring, but depressing, but we can still enjoy the beach. But yeah, no, it's always a busman's holiday. Everywhere I go, I'm inspired by stuff. So, but fortunately, I love what I do.
Yeah. Yeah, you can't turn that off, I'm guessing, once you can see it. Lovely. Well, thank you very much to you both. So we are now going to turn our attention to our second pairing, Emma Maloney and Dr. Becker Lovell. Sorry, I'm getting more exotic. So Emma Maloney is a Devon-based interdisciplinary printmaker, and her work combines different printmaking processes such as screen print and relief print, and she works with animation and 3D installations. She designs and makes wallpaper, delivers printmaking workshops, and explores experimental ways of printmaking without a press. Dr. Becker Lovell's research focuses on understanding the ways people can benefit from proximity to and contact with natural environments. She is specifically interested in the health and well-being benefits of higher quality and biodiverse spaces and places. So Emma, we'll start with you. And we have our fantastic Becky Andrew is going to do your slides.
Thank you. I've just got a few slides because I wanted to kind of give an example of what interested me. Like Naomi, we were both drawn to the natural history section of the DEI. And I agree, we were completely spoilt to be in this incredible collection. So we were both up there in the little Georgian gallery exploring I was looking at the botanical books, and these are 3 exquisite hardbound books. The last one of the conifer is a Veitch catalogue, and that led me to research the legacy of the Veitch family in Exeter. I mean, it's quite extraordinary that over 100 years, 5 generations of one family ran one of Europe's largest commercial nurseries, importing at the end about 1,600 plants. So many of these we will know now. These are things that will be, you know, in most of our household plants, orchids, ferns. There's whole sections of country houses. Exeter University are planted by the Veitch family. And Andrew, could I go on to the next slide? And these books are filled with exquisite illustrations like this. So, you know, full of botanical illustrations, which as a printmaker, I'm really drawn to. These are wood engravings. But these are also very isolated, and the aesthetics of botanical illustration is interesting. It's essentially you're identifying and understanding a plant, and there's something timeless about them. And I was interested in, it kind of led me to questions about the gendered roles within natural science. So on the one hand, we're in this era of this time, these books have been published, this Victorian era of orchid mania, and the Veitches are sending out, you know, tens of plant collectors around the globe. And these are local, these are Exeter, Cornish brothers like the William and Thomas Lobb. These are men that are going out completely around the globe to bring back exotic plants for many reasons. And then on the other hand, where is the female role in this? So generally the Victorian woman was consigned, if she wanted to work in natural sciences, to a kind of polite botany. There's a very passive femininity to illustration, although these were wood engravings by men, and certainly an association with women and flowers. So I wanted to find out a bit more. This led me to find out about Marion North, who many people might know through her gallery that she built herself at Kew to display her 830 paintings. Andrew, can we go on to my last slide? And these are Marion North's paintings. So they are interesting to me because she's operating at the same time as the Veitches. One of her fans is Charles Darwin. The Veitches would also have been importing plants back that would have hugely affected what Darwin was looking at, things like the comet orchid in Madagascar. And however, what's interesting is she's painting plants in their context. So unlike the kind of very clinical versions of the plants, she's much more emotionally engaged with the landscape. And she's also carving out she's a bit of a trailblazer. She's carving out a really interesting role for herself, admittedly, because she's got a privileged social status. You know, she looked after her father until she was 40 and then had the financial means to travel. And she did. She covered 5 continents and painted everything that she saw. In the sense that she's not quite a botanical artist, but she's painting landscapes. And that's the other thing that I think is an interesting theme, is the difference between botanical art and landscape art. And she is neither. Her work doesn't conform to the established conventions of botanical painting, but neither is she recognized as a fine artist. She's self-taught, she's amateur, but that also, I mean, that's a difficult word, but it means that she's in a kind of visual limbo. But I love that about her. I think that she is just doing exactly what she wants. She's painting what she's interested in. She's obsessive about the plants, and she's bringing them back. And then she also gets to decide, because of her privilege, she chooses to create a gallery at Kew. So she is kind of indicating that she wants her work to remain in a scientific domain. So my work is responding to both of these. I've specifically chosen plants that the Veitch family brought back to Exeter, and plants that were named after them. And that's another theme that I think is really interesting, is the naming of these. You're at the height of imperialism here, and Victorian collectors are bringing back ethnographic items, but also plants. Plants are being treated as a commodity. In fact, people referred to them at this time as horticultural gold. So as a wallpaper maker and a printmaker, I'm interested in creating a piece of work that explores pattern and explores also the contemporary relationship with wallpaper, because at this time in France, actually, they were starting to make scenic wallpapers. So the idea of the exotic and the wild being huge on walls. So I want to create an installation that uses these plants, but also it's a very Western view of the plants and the scenes. And now these are much more familiar to us. These aren't exotic species that are only being introduced that you might only see once if you get to Kew or you see an illustration of it. These are things that we probably have in our homes. And I want to play around with size and layering them. So it's been an interesting process. I still don't really know what the piece is going to look like, because it's a huge scale for me to work on. And at the moment I'm cutting things, laser cutting, printing. Andrew, if you go to my screen, I can just quickly show some examples. So I'm just doing lots of painting on ink on wallpaper, experimenting with repeat pattern. And these are all going to be part of like a kind of decorative wallpaper. So that's where I am. But Rebecca will be able to expand on these themes. And there are so many that the story of plants brings up.
Becca, the floor's yours.
Thank you. I'll just share. Right, is that the right slide?
Oh, I can't see it yet, but there might be a wee delay.
Come through. Oh,
Is it the spotlight, Andrew? Ah, there we go.
Is that the right slide?
Yes, it is. We're in the right place.
Sorry, you think I'd get used to this by now?
Oh, good.
In a year. But I want to say thank you very much for having me to come speak at this event. And I'm a lecturer at the European Centre for Environments and Human Health. And as Sarah introduced me, I look at the links between environments and health and really stand on the shoulders of giants, as most scientists describe themselves, in terms of absolutely millennia of history, in terms of how we think about the environment. And actually, what I thought I'd talk about today comes off a comment that Emma made about gendered roles and gendered relationships with the environment. And I thought I'd bring it into the current era, much as Kerry did, and start off talking about a really important piece of ambition at an international level, the Sustainable Development Goals, which I'm sure you all know about, but basically they're described as a blueprint for peace, prosperity, people and the planet, and a way of integrating a number of different ambitions. And one of the goals within the Sustainable Development Goals is Goal 11, which is to make cities inclusive, safe, resilient and sustainable. And actually, I think this should be broadened to make living environments. It shouldn't just be about cities. But within goal 11 is a sub-ambition of by 2030 to provide universal access to safe, inclusive and accessible green and public spaces. And I thought I'd talk about this because this sort of embodies most of what I do and a whole era of history in terms of how we think about what matters to us and what promotes our health and well-being. And this is just a print from Marion North of a medley of flowers, but I just chose it because what I do really sort of systematizes and codifies and evidences something which we've documented as humans throughout history. And actually some of our very earliest writings and depictions of things that matter to us are of the environment. And what we do now is probably in the last 10 years or so has sought to evidence that role of nature and the importance of nature to human health and well-being. And we see evidence of this in all sorts of different types of media, from scientific writings through to beautiful artworks which span art and science, such as Marion North's botanical pictures. And we know that nature has immense spiritual, ethical, and cultural value to us. And this is beginning to be reflected in policy. We see across a number of different types of policy spheres, from health to environment, this understanding that nature is fundamentally important. It keeps us alive, but also enriches our lives in all sorts of different ways. However, our relationship with nature is fundamentally gendered. It's not sort of equal between the genders, between different communities, between different socioeconomic groupings, between different ethnicities either. And one of my lovely colleagues at the centre, Francesca Boyd, who was one of our students, did some analysis of data about one of the ways in which we sort of express our relationship with nature is through going to visit nature recreationally. She did some research looking at who did and didn't visit natural environments. And what she found is probably you could all have a guess at, that certain communities didn't visit nature for all sorts of different reasons. And women were one of those groups, and that intersected with a number of other different ways of which we think of ourselves, including age, in terms of our health status and a number of other factors. And this is an important factor. So if I put the rest of the text up on the Sustainable Development Goal, sub-goal 11, so by 2030, provide universal access to safe, inclusive, accessible green public spaces, in particular for women and for children, older persons and persons with disabilities. And this is just reflecting that gendered relationship we have with nature. And this is something that we think about a lot, and this is where the rest of my work focuses on is how we can use nature in an equitable way to promote people's health and well-being. And we use nature in all sorts of different ways. It can be through increasing the greenery in our living environment to make spaces sort of health promoting that sort of pathway. We can use nature as a setting for health promotion. We've seen this with the rise of what we call green prescriptions, which is where doctors can prescribe the use of the environment in various different ways to promote health. But we also see it in the ways in which we can talk about and reflect on the environment and importance to our cultures and our communities. And some of the reasons why we see these gendered relationships with nature, and particularly in the world in which I work in terms of how we engage with nature, have a myriad of different factors which determine it. And as Emma spoke briefly about, many of these have very, very deep historical roots, and our relationships are determined by some of the cultures in which we have grown up, and they vary around the world, but there are some common themes. Some of the reasons why we see that certain gendered relationships with nature, and particularly who does and doesn't feel comfortable with going outdoors and experiencing nature, and particularly expressing some of those desires which we see in people like Marion North sit and paint a landscape are to do with feelings of safety and feelings of belonging within landscapes and who deserves and should be there. This is a picture of my friend and colleague, a scientist at University of Exeter, out walking in East Devon. And I walk on my own a lot, but I get asked by people quite regularly, am I okay? Am I lost? And you know, I don't necessarily have the freedom to express the ways in which I want to experience nature, to sit in a hollow and take pictures of birds, for instance, as other people might necessarily do so. We also have very gendered notions of what's acceptable to do in the natural environment. This is a picture of another one of my colleagues participating in the World Surf Kayak competition up in the north of Scotland. But we have very definite ideas which are developed very early in childhood quite often and transmitted societally and culturally about what is appropriate for women particularly to do in nature and the natural environment, how they should dress, what they should do, what behaviours they should express and so on. And this develops very early, as I said before, in childhood. We go through many processes of culturation about what's appropriate for people to do in different environments and what kind of roles they should express in nature. When I was doing my PhD, I looked at forest schools, which is a type of education in the outdoors where children do their education in nature. And it's very integrated kind of education where they do a lot of science as well as arts-based activities. And one of the really, really interesting things about forest school, and I think that the setting was a fundamental component of this, was that the activities and the spaces weren't gendered in the way that other spaces which the children occupied were. So the school playground, for instance, had very definite gendered lines about what the girls and the boys could do in those spaces, whereas the forest, being novel and not sort of culturally delineated in such a way, meant that the little girls could run around in similar ways in which the boys could. And I think it's a really interesting, hopeful potential for the future that we can change some of these very deep set cultured ways in which we express respond to environments. And we know that, that these perceptions and attitudes carry through the life course into adulthood and define some of the choices that we make in terms of the jobs we do and the activities we choose. Another anecdote was when I finished my PhD, I decided that training as a forester would be a good idea. So I went to work for the National Trust for a year, and one of the things that I did was learn to wield a chainsaw. And when I rocked up to the course on the first day, I was asked what I was doing there. And I thought it was just a really interesting example of the ways in which there were assumptions made about my role as a woman and what I should be doing in the natural environment and how I should respond and act in that place. And these questions matter at the moment. We're going through, likely to be going through a very deep period of austerity. And the environment sector is one of the public sectors which feels cuts very deeply alongside the arts sector. And I think we have deep questions about how we value the environment, how we think about equity in the environment, and how we reflect some of those millennia-long threads of history demonstrating the value of nature to health, to well-being in our public spending. And I think there's a real danger that we will miss sub-goal 11 of the Sustainable Development Goals to make access to green spaces an equitable opportunity, particularly for women, if we don't think more about how nature matters to us and all the different factors which determine whether or not women, as well as other groups, can use and respond and express and engage with nature equitably. So I'll finish up now, but thank you very much for listening and having me along today.
Fantastic, thank you so much, Becker and Emma. And I hope for the room, you're getting a sense of how these four talks sort of intersect, that there are these themes that come up time and again. So Emma and Becker, just to start, what comes across really strongly is power and control in relation to these things, and how humanity has sort of worked into alongside with the natural world. And I think there's something really interesting about the natural world being othered. And so Becky, you're sort of, it strikes me as a very kind of Western experience about you can be selective as to whether you go into nature or not. And there are large parts of the world where society and nature are sort of far more closely integrated. And I can see that tying back to maybe a lack of understanding of climate impact. And Emma, you spoke about horticultural gold and the commodification of nature, and a sense of ownership. And again, what ownership in relation to nature means in different parts of the world. So with this kind of angle of power, it sort of winds me up. I mean, what kind of emotional response do you have to these themes as they come up in your researches? Becker, would you like to start?
Yeah, I'll have a go. I think it's a really interesting angle at which we can think about this is to do with power, and there's a lot in that. You know, at the very individual level, the power some groups have over others determine whether or not they engage with certain spaces. It makes me incredibly sad to look at Twitter at the moment and see some of the young women's voices, on Twitter saying that they don't feel comfortable going to their park with their binoculars. They don't feel safe, for instance. And, you know, that's an element of power of certain types of people having over other groups. And it's not necessarily of men over women, but there's, you know, critiques of young women that's not a appropriate thing for a sort of 16-year-old girl to be doing. They should have other interests. But I think in a more sort of higher level dimension, there are very important questions about who has the right to determine what kind of spaces we have and what we do with the environment. And I think there's a very distinct feeling at the moment that certain women's voices particularly aren't heard. There's a bit of a stink being kicked up at the moment that the delegation for the COP coming this autumn, there's no women involved in the high level sort of direction of that. So you know, even in 2021, we still see, you know, power disparities throughout the system about how women can engage with and contribute to environmental management.
I thought the examples you gave were very powerful about a woman alone in nature is the sort of source of concern and a bit of an aberration. And society thinks it's meaning well by just sort of wanting to shuffle you back into the kitchen, and without even consciously kind of realizing that how that is still a thing. Emma, what were your sort of responses to some of these big themes?
Yeah, there's so much to unpack in those themes. I didn't feel emotionally angry about it. I just felt there's a lot there, and I think also actually Marion North, it seems quite simple, but actually it's quite, I feel like she's quite a complex artist, and that she is still supporting a very patriarchal view of nature. She's deferring to James Hooker, she's deferring to Q all the time. She's presenting her paintings, but not ever saying I've discovered something new, or wanting to submit thing. She's not operating as a scientist. She's still operating as a sort of passive artist. But then equally, she is also perpetuating a very Western idea, and we talked about this with Becker before. The language of plants and the power of the West, appropriating these, bringing these back, creating hybrids. It was for the gain of, you know, the benefit of the colonies. And where is anything? How do we find out anything about those plants and how they were used by Indigenous people? And we will have lost a lot of the names for them and the language around those as they came back here at that time. So but I don't think my work won't show that. I think it will just be that maybe these themes are things we can explore. I haven't got a view I'm trying to share.
It's yes, I think I need to ask the question, but what comes to mind is, being from New Zealand, we have gorse, and gorse is a Scottish plant that makes a great hedgerow in the Northern Hemisphere. You put it into a Southern Hemisphere environment and it just goes whoosh. It just has a lovely time, spreads out, and it's an absolute nightmare to get rid of. And it's really, it smells lovely, but my relationship with gorse is very different on this side of the world than it is in New Zealand. So we've had a question from Annie Murdoch. For the artists, how did the remit trade and exchange form your early thinking about what you were considering proposing for the commission, and how did your visit to the DEI possibly shift your early ideas? Emma, would you like to start?
Yeah.
And then we'll bring in Naomi.
That's a great question. Well, it also, apart from the collection, it made me think about what, not everybody will necessarily access the DEI, and I wanted the trade and exchange to be a theme, to be relevant with what's happening in Exeter now with creative industries and cultural organisations. So my work collaborates with the Fab Lab, which is at the library, and that's a fabrication laboratory where you can do your own 3D printing, laser cutting. So I've been working with them to laser cut a lot of the design, and also Double Elephant Print Workshop, who are a community print resource, so that people who see the work can also realise that there are ways that they can make work with these organisations. These are public organisations for everybody. But in respect of the collection, I think I never thought that I would be so interested in the natural history books. I had no idea what would be there. I thought probably I'd begin with something visual like postcards, but there was so much to choose from.
Naomi, how did your starting points move through the process?
So they sort of moved away and then maybe back again. I've been looking at the River Exe and the estuary and the ocean for a little while. So I was already thinking a bit about probably trade and exchange in terms of travel and journeys, and a little bit about that sort of tidal trade and exchange of nutrients. But certainly I never thought I'd be looking at shells. I thought it was going to be something far more sort of big and romantic and, ships and whatever. So that's been quite interesting. Again, I mean, I think probably there were 100 different projects I could do from the collection, and I'd very much like to go back and do some of those. So it was quite hard looking at all the different possibilities and trying to narrow it down and just say, okay, well, let's just go with this one for the moment. But what I found fascinating is actually all of those links come back in again. So, with all of those meanings and layers, actually, I'm sort of looking at the things that I was interested in anyway. But yes, certainly it's trying to make it. I've had conversations with Emma Dunn from the DEI about the kind of space that it is, and it's a sort of gentleman's club. It's leather armchairs and musty sort of bookshelves, and you do get a feeling of slightly you're not possibly supposed to be there. And she's very much trying to change that, I think. So it's trying to sort of say, actually, this is all right for everybody. This is open to everybody. And so I think this shop front exhibition is an amazing way of actually taking it out into the city centre and just saying, look at what we have here. Look at what's accessible. And it relates to natural history and the natural world, and Emma's work does as well. Look at what we have on our doorstep that is out there that you can find out, that you can do, that totally relates to this collection, that is actually part of your heritage and should belong to you and you should feel part of. So I think it's an important part, but we do have to take that step to bring it into contemporary culture, which is the shopping centre.
Fantastic, thank you. We talk a lot in galleries about the threshold barrier, that people make decisions about, is this a place for me or is it not? Do I go through the door or do I not? And the lovely thing about having works of art on the high street and all the rich ideas that feed into them is that it then becomes part of an environment that it's coming to you. And hopefully can form a bit of a sort of lure or a cue that could lead to more. I can't resist just one final question, Becker, about your lovely plant in the foreground, given that we're talking about all things natural world. Would you like to just perhaps add something about the benefits of plants, greenery, that relationship, what we can, to end on a happy note, what we can get from having the natural world around us?
Yeah, these are my my orange grove. It has to be one of the easiest plants to grow. You just stick a pip in the ground and up it comes, and they're almost unkillable. Even if all its leaves drop off, they'll probably come back. In terms of the benefits of green space and nature for health, they're myriad, and they're expressed through, I mean, the mechanisms are very plural. We know that having a plant is beneficial. There's been an interesting study done a few years ago now that stratified floors on a old people's home, and the floor which were given a plant to look after had greater life expectancy than the floor that didn't have a plant to look after. And lots of things were going on. Plants have some role, some plants have some role in purifying the air. It's something to care for. There's sort of nurturing pathways there as well, something to look forward to in the future. It gives you a sense of time and season. But more broadly, we know that people who live in greener environments have better health, and that's through all sorts of different pathways. They feel like they have better health, so that they'll report better health, through to observable physiological differences in their health. But the really most important thing for us, I think, is particularly in terms of how we think about whether they're adequately funded going into the future, is that their greener environments appear to be ecogenic. So when we compare two communities which are similarly socioeconomically deprived, we tend to find better health in those communities with more greenery in them. And we think all sorts of different things are going on in terms of what we call the ecosystem services, so all those basic processes of nature which keep us alive, through to higher quality living environments and greater quality of life, which certainly in the West we associate with better lives. So you just think of a tree-lined street or sitting in a meadow in the summer, all sorts of ways in which we think nature benefits our health. And we see that expressed in scientific work that I'm involved in the centre, through to the beautiful art that Naomi and Emma produce. And enrich our lives through all sorts of different pathways.
Gorgeous way to finish. Thank you so much. I hope that has whetted your appetite to come see these final artworks in person. And so we have a launch date, everything else being equal, of the 12th of April. And if the government roadmap holds, the work will be up until the end of May. So there will be chances to see it both during the May bank holiday and the May half term. And Emma will be located using 2 window panes in the old Tourist Information Centre at the top of Southern Hay. And that's also going to be used for the new Exeter Works programme. And Naomi will be taking over the old Carphone warehouse, thanks to Princess Hay and Exeter Phoenix. And it's also worth keeping in mind, I'm sure you're going to form an orderly queue to get into the DEI as soon as possible. And that's planning to reopen on the 18th of May, and public tours will begin again from the afternoon of the 19th. So just to wrap, I want to say a huge thank you to our panel, Naomi, Kerry, Emma and Becker. Fascinating talks, fascinating work that you all do, and thank you for your generosity in sharing it with us. And a huge thanks to our technical support, Andrew White, who's done a great job of keeping us all on track and keeping my stress levels low, so we like that. And thank you very much for your time and attention this evening coming along. We will be pinging an evaluation form your way tomorrow morning, so do let us know what you think. And sign up to our Arts and Culture newsletter if you'd like to keep in touch. So that's us. I hope you enjoy the rest of your evening.